Hi, my name is Daniel Burke, and my project addresses data that has many parties, of course, from service members deployed there to refugees that remain in the country. And of course, without access to substantial healthcare, financial constraints, and destruction of Iraq's infrastructure since the war began, refugees and internally displaced peoples are particularly at risk of this infectious disease. So what we traditionally think of as the causes of this multi-drug resistant baumannii phenomenon in Iraq, we largely use a civilian paradigm where a lack of sterility in these military elements. The issue with using the civilian paradigm is that conflict presents a unique set of circumstances that we have to take into account, such as poor debridement of necrotic tissue around these traumatic skin and soft tissue injuries and subsequent contamination of these wounds that aren't typically present in civilian settings. What's interesting about this multi-drug resistant baumannii phenomenon in Iraq is that civilians have multi-drug resistant baumannii upon evaluation, so not after extensive hospitalization or antibiotic regimens that we normally would attribute multi-drug resistance to. So what exactly is happening? This suggests that multi-drug resistant baumannii in Iraq, post-OIF, either has an environmental source or is able to develop antibiotic resistance in the microenvironment. And we hypothesize is that heavy metals present within these skin and soft tissue injuries from shrapnel and other metal debris that's embedded in the wound can provide a selective pressure for baumannii to not only develop resistance to heavy metals, but also antibiotic resistance as well. And so what we need to first establish is a comprehensive understanding of how this process occurs and how it can occur. The purpose of my project was an extensive literature review in order to provide a solid foundation for investigating what is now a currently under-researched potential driver of multi-drug resistance in Iraq since the conflict began, or in places where you have high heavy metal and SSTI burdens, such as other conflict regions. And so just to begin, there's overwhelming evidence that Iraq has been inundated with heavy metals, actually since the Iraq-Iran war back in the 1980s. So since OIF in particular, Iraq has been in a protracted state of conflict that has inundated the environment with heavy metals, the use of munitions. And just to give a sense of the scope of this, there have been 22,000 munitions that have been dropped by US coalition forces in Iraq and Syria alone just in 2015. And so tangential evidence for this heavy metal toxicity in Iraq can actually be derived from heavy metal pollution that has caused a pandemic of pediatric neurodevelopmental disorders in Iraq around cities where you have military installations. So children with these developmental disorders will have significantly elevated levels of heavy metals commonly used in munitions within their hair follicles and deciduous teeth. And so this provides evidence that heavy metals from munitions that are overrepresented in areas heavily affected by conflict in Iraq have long-term deleterious effects on human health. And although we know that these heavy metals can act as neurotoxins and teratogens, we don't actually really understand if they can also affect the microbiome of the region and thus drive this multi-drug resistance phenomenon in a rock. So how can heavy metals and antibiotic resistance actually be co-selected? We're not really concerned with mutations within existing genes as we are with the acquisition of heavy metal and antibiotic resistance genes and incorporation into the genome through processes such as horizontal gene transfer, in which plasmids, transposons, and integrons can actually be incorporated into the genome of a naive baumannii. And this baumannii can now develop resistance to both heavy metals and antibiotics. And so this process can be facilitated by mobile genetic elements, or MGEs. And so MGEs can provide a source of linked heavy metal and antibiotic resistance genes that can be incorporated into the genome of a naive baumannii. And so this is just a quick example of a transposon-based MGE. And so this has a variety of genes incorporated within it. Some of these are related to metabolism. Some of these are related to just overall basic fitness. But the three I want to highlight in particular are IS elements, which actually allow for these strands of genetic information to be incorporated into the genome of a naive baumannii. Resistance determinants, such as Nudeli metallo-beta-lactamase 1, which provides resistance to beta-lactam-based antibiotics, as well as divalent cation tolerance proteins. So these are genes that provide resistance to metals in a variety of mechanisms, from oxidation to metal efflux. And one MGE in particular that's of interest in this context are AbaR-type resistance islands. So AbaR-type resistance islands were first characterized in the AYE European strain of baumannii, which of course has now become embedded within Iraqi's medical infrastructure due to the medical evacuation route that the US has used. And what's interesting about AbaR-type resistance islands is that they contain not only transposon backbones, which implies that this is a mobile genetic element that can be transferred to naive baumannii in the event of heavy metal antibiotic stress, but this also contains numerous regions that contain antibiotic resistance genes, as well as genes that confer resistance to heavy metals, such as the ARS operon here, which is involved in arsenic efflux. And so there is, of course, a high diversity of AbaR-type resistance islands that have been characterized in the literature. And the key to this continued diversification are mobile gene cassettes and integrase genes that allow the incorporation of exogenous antibiotic resistance or metal resistance genes. So these resistance islands are very plastic. They continue to evolve as they incorporate different genes from both baumannii as well as other bacterial species that can be present in wounds. And what's very important to elucidate from this is that heavy metals, there's evidence that heavy metals deposited by small arms during a conflict can select for stable mutations in baumannii that confer resistance to heavy metals and antibiotics. And this is very important, that linked metal resistance genes and antibiotic resistance genes on these mobile genetic elements can select for antibiotic resistance in the absence of any antibiotic selective pressure, which implies that heavy metal pressure or selective pressure present in a wound that's embedded with shrapnel or other metal debris can provide a sufficient selective force to drive the acquisition of these mobile genetic elements and allow for baumannii within these wounds to not only develop resistance to these metals in order to survive, but also tangentially acquire antibiotic resistance genes without ever being exposed to an antibiotic. So the long-term consequences of this, of course, are that heavy metals in the environment and embedded in these wounds can provide a selective pressure for multi-drug resistant baumannii long after a conflict has ended, which of course hinders any kind of capacity in which Iraq can start rebuilding its healthcare infrastructure. And much more concerning is that refugees and internally displaced peoples are particularly vulnerable to both untreated soft tissue injuries and environmental pollution, which both can contribute to the rapid expansion of multi-drug resistant baumannii. And this is evidenced by the fact that these two demographics have experienced startling occurrences of multi-drug resistant baumannii since OIF. And so this is an element of the refugee crisis in Iraq that needs to be addressed. And so I would just like to extend my thanks and gratitude towards Dr. Zaman for being an incredible advisor, as well as motivating me, myself, and others to pursue work that is both under-researched and is for the greater good. Dr. Doer for guiding me at this project's inception in HC 450. Dr. Masiki for advising me in the senior course and just being a very good friend and colleague. Dr. Preston for being an amazing director of KHC, as well as everyone else in KHC that has made this an absolutely wonderful experience. Thank you.